the No Limit Selling Podcast, where mindset meets sales and leadership. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the No Limit Selling Podcast. And today we have Andy Paul, and we're going to talk about, there's this problem people talk about, the last mile problem. It's like whether it's taking fiber and getting into someone's home, or it's getting the sales right to the end. And if you don't get it past that 1 yard line, it's all for naught. Andy, welcome to the program.
Umar, thank you for having me.
So normally I spend a lot of time at the front end of the sales process, but doesn't matter how well you do there. If you don't do that last little bit well, it's frustrating as hell, and you invest a lot of time and equity to get there. How do you see the world? Why do you think that's a problem? And why does Andy Paul exist to help the world do that better?
Oh gosh, why is that a problem? Well, it's maybe part of the problem is what people think is the last mile shouldn't be the last mile. So, well, I think that when you look at, let's say, a business-to-business sales situation, there's multiple decisions that someone's making, and oftentimes, from perspective of a seller, they think that sort of the decision that's being made is at the end is, okay, are we going to do this or not? And actually that decision, if you're doing this well, that decision happens pretty early in the process. Is you have to help your buyer make that decision to make a change in their business. And the earlier you help them make that decision, the better, because then from that point forward, they're really focused on deciding, okay, how are we going to make that change and who are we going to make that change with? But, very high fraction, it depends on the research you read, but anywhere from 40 to 80% of B2B opportunities apparently stall out and the customer makes no decision. And that happens because the customer hadn't made the decision to make a change. And so they get all the way through their process, and you think they're going to give you an order, but they haven't really said, yeah, this makes sense for us as a business. The idea of making a change, not buying this particular product or service.
Right. So oftentimes, this would be my hypothesis, is, hold that thought for a minute. I'm going to go to another thought, come back to this.
Sure.
I don't remember the exact players in this, but there's a really famous siege where they've got this siege of this castle, and basically people that are doing the siege for a year kind of know what's going on from their point of view, and people inside the castle have a different point of view. And right near the end, they actually catapult a live cow over the gates. Filled with barley, basically to say, fuck you, we're right. Doing fine, which is not. They're on the brink of starvation. But because there's this like blind wall between the two, we misread. And so coming back to the sales situation, oftentimes salespeople misread the situation. They have the notion that that decision's already been made when it hasn't. So do you think it's just that happens? And how do we stop that from happening? How do we double check that they really have made this decision that we want to make a change?
Well, we sort of have to get out of sort of this conventional thinking about the process the buyer is going through, because most sellers think about the process the buyer is going through their own lens, right? Which is, hey, we've got these 6 sales stages we put into our CRM system that, we've got initial contact, initial discovery call, qualification, demo, blah, 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 blah. And those bear no sense of reality in terms of what the buyer is going through, right? They're not aligned to it at all. They don't correlate to the steps the buyer is going through. So in a broader sense, and this is, a longer term project, but as sellers have to start delineating where they are in relation with the buyer and the buyer decision based on where the buyer actually is in their process, not in the seller's process. And so buyers, when you look at it, they really go through sort of 3 main steps in making a decision. Is the first step is what I call the what step. And it's really not, these aren't even sequential steps. They also happen somewhat simultaneously. But the first one is, hey, what's our problem? What do we want to achieve? So I call it the what phase.
Right.
And everybody goes through that. Now, as a seller, your job is to help the buyer define not only the scope of their problem, but also potential outcomes they can achieve by addressing the problem. So that's really your first job. And if you're doing that, then it's really as part of that what step that you help the buyer say, okay, oh yeah, if we can come to this potential outcome by addressing this particular challenge within our business or by seizing this particular opportunity in the marketplace, that's worth doing. And you've given enough information relative to what the costs are and so on that they can do an analysis at that point to say, yeah, if this were to come true, this makes sense for us. Now, it's not specifically about your product, but it helps them make that preliminary decision to make a change in their business. So they're going to go forward now, invest their time and attention and the resources heading toward wanting to achieve that potential outcome.
Okay, so let's kind of pause there just for a second. Many times, the buyer has a sense of what the problem is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the job of the salesperson, the seller, sometimes to get them to actually realize what the real problem is.
Sure.
Or help them really get clarification.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. Yes.
Okay, so we've got step one. I've got a problem and this is an outcome that I want. What's step two?
Well, then what happens is the buyer wants to know how they're going to achieve their desired outcomes, right? So this is when they're going to start getting involved in the products and the services that would help them be able to achieve those outcomes if they implemented it. So in that point, as a seller, if you've been able to help the buyer define what the outcomes could be, then you sort of have the inside track. I mean, you sort of need, as a seller, you need to look at this as almost like a design perspective, right? I need to win the what, right? I need to be the seller that influences the what. And so if you do that, then you're sort of in an advantageous position going into what I call the how phase of things, which is, okay, how are we going to achieve? And what your job is at that point is to help lead the buyer through a series of trade-offs. And it's not just, hey, I'm pitching my product. It's, well, you could do this or this. Now, both these options may be you, right? Ideally, they're you.
Right.
We could do A or B. Oh, you want to do B? Great. Well, great. Now with B, we could do C or D. Oh, great. And you help the buyer navigate that process of arriving at a, some people might call it a specification or, a final, we'll call it specification of what the solution is for them. And that itself is like another little, victory you want to get, is because that's your design win, right? And the buyer now has this final specification and it looks like it's largely based on a product or service that we sell. Now, at that point, buyers typically say, depending on the size of the deal, if it's a really big deal, they may say, okay, well, great. We've got this final specification. We're going to shop this out there, right? We're going to ask 3 or 4 companies to bid on it. Hey, they're all going to get that RFP or RFQ, whatever they're looking at. And they're going to look at it and say, oh, shit, that looks like Umar designed it. I don't think we're going to bid on this one. I mean, at that point, you have the inside track. So the third, if they've got the what, you've got the how, now it's the who. They need to choose who they want to work with to achieve their desired outcomes. So if you've won, quote unquote, won the what phase and you've won the how phase, you're going to win the who phase. So it's sort of a series of, like I said, almost design wins that you're shooting for through the process, but it has to be preceded by, at the sort of the culmination of the what phase, the buyer making that decision that, yeah, this makes sense for us and we will make a decision to make this change.
So if it was you and I sitting down and saying, okay, we've got this problem, we go through this process, it's quite easy to do compared with a lot of the decisions have multiple people on the buyer side.
Sure.
And so, which adds a level of complexity. So how do you keep things grounded when you have multiple stakeholders, and sometimes one of the stakeholders, unbeknownst to you, isn't in the room with you? So let's take a look at option A first.
Yes. Yeah.
You've got multiple people. How do you keep this ship rolling, the train rolling, to get to the conclusion?
it's a communication challenge, right? So, your job is sort of early on when you're defining sort of what this most important thing is to the buyer, this outcome or whatever, is you have to identify who it's most important to. Because there's always one person it's most important to. And the thing that sellers, I think sometimes are a disservice done to them when they're given training, which is, well, there's this stakeholder group and there's sort of this consensus that's made, which defies all reality when it comes to human interaction, right? Which is you put a
Right.
group of people together, somebody's more dominant than somebody else. And that's generally the person, not always, but generally the person that this, most important outcome is, it's most important to them. They've got the biggest stake in it.
Right.
First of all, you need to find out who that is, because that's going to be the person that's going to be the most influential in the ultimate decision. But then also, just as I said, identifying who else is important in terms of making a contribution and investing the time to understand from them sort of two perspectives, right? Which is, one is what's their perspective on this decision relative to the company. And then secondly is their perspective on what this decision does relative to them personally. Because
that emotional thing drives.
all the stakeholders look at things from two perspectives, or all decision makers do. What's in it for the company? What's in it for me? So you need to develop that level of understanding with your stakeholders. So in an effort to build, somewhat of a consensus behind that, making this decision, you understand the things that are really motivating them. You can understand the open questions that you need to be able to help them with, to help them in their own mind make progress toward making the decision. And so it's simple communications, simple asking good questions, listening to really understand what's important to that person as an individual, and helping them arrive at the same place somewhat at the same time as everybody else.
So you have a boot camp, Andy, that takes people through this. Tell us about the boot camp.
Yeah, we've done that in the past. It's sort of unfortunately a bit on hiatus right now, but may very well come back in the future. But it's really designed to take people through what I call the pillars, the 4 pillars of selling in. So if in my book, Sell Without Selling Out, I define you can engage in sort of traditional salesy behavior, which buyers dislike, and surveys are very clear about that, which is what I label as selling out. Or you can sell in, which is, how do you create this experience for the buyer that helps them make their decision, right? And it's by the process of doing that, it's a differentiated experience from that you would experience with other sellers. And so in the boot camp, we took sellers through how to implement these 4 pillars of selling in, which are connection, curiosity, understanding, and generosity, to help buyers, gather and make sense of information they need and get their questions answered with sort of the least investment of their time and attention possible.
So talk to me about the generosity phase.
Well, think about what your job is as a seller, right? So generosity is not a word that's often. You said problem solver, which it is to some degree, right? But I define as job as a seller is to listen to the buyer, to understand the things that are most important to them, right? In terms of the opportunities they want to achieve, the outcomes they desire, business outcomes they have for making a change, and the challenges they're facing to make a change. Understanding these, truly understanding them, and then helping the buyer achieve their ambitions, achieve their goals, achieve their desired outcomes. So we're there to listen and to help. So generosity is about being very directed in how you help the buyer make progress in their buying process. At the end of the day, for the buyer, we have all these terms and definitions we use of value. What's a value in a sale? Well, there's no necessarily unitary definition of it. But I talk about in the book, and when I talk with the companies I work with, is that value really is progress. That's what the buyer wants. As a result of interacting with you as a seller, if they are at the end of them, let's say a sales call, at the end of the sales call, they feel like they're closer to making the decision than they were before the sales call, then that had value for them. And that value could have been giving them data, could have been answering a question, could have been a demonstration. It could be one of anything. But the point is that interaction move them closer to making a decision. And that then becomes the challenge for every time you interact with your buyer. You have that obligation to help them move closer to making a decision. Otherwise, why are you taking up their time and attention?
Absolutely. And one of the ways I describe it, which is probably not as concise as yours, is very much if I can provide an insight to my buyer, it's a good sales call.
Yeah. Well, that's one way of helping them make progress is, you've opened their eyes to another way of perceiving their challenges or the potential outcomes they can receive, whatever, or achieve, whatever. Could be that. Could be you asked them a really great question, right? It could be that they had a question about, the operation of your system, or it could be one of a myriad of things. But by helping them answer those questions, by helping them gain that insight, by helping them think more deeply and broadly about what they're trying to achieve, you're helping them move closer to making their decision, and that's value for them.
So, Andy, one of the things that sometimes as sellers, it's hard to diagnose where the problem is. So, what are some of the questions that people can ask themselves, their organizations, to really get that, it's that last stage of winning or not winning, like where the problem actually is?
Well, again, you're trying to do that as early as possible in the process, but it's.
I meant more in terms of company ABC. They're looking at their numbers and going, we're not getting the sales that we want. There's a problem somewhere. How do you help them diagnose it in terms of, we didn't actually do the what, the how, the who effectively early on?
Well, I think I'll sort of reframe that for you. Is I think if you're coming in as a salesperson, you're trying to help a buyer diagnose a problem, right? The key is you have to go in and ask questions and listen without an agenda, right? Is you basically have to say, look, and the agenda meaning concerned with your product and service, is you have to envision yourself going in and helping the buyer, maybe as a consultant would do, right? As a consultant, company might hire you to say, look, we're facing this challenge in our business and we're not sure how to solve it. We're not sure, do we need to invest in new equipment, invest in a new, technology, blah, blah, blah. So they'd hire a consulting firm to come and help them. Well, that is what you're doing as a seller. Your initial conversations, you should envision that you're not actually selling a product. You're there to find out what are the challenges the buyer has and make sure you really understand it. And if you understand it, then, you can make the buyer perhaps feel that you understand it as well. And that's something that has tremendous value for them, right? Is to feel like, oh gosh, these guys really get us. And so in my book, I lay out 6 different types of questions you can ask that, if deployed appropriately, you're going to get to the point where you're going to understand what's really driving the buyer.
Right.
And you may be able to help the buyer understand the way they didn't before. So various question types, could be, one of my favorite type is what I call an impact question. And what you're trying to do there with the impact question is, when you ask about impact, you always want to make sure that you're asking people to quantify something. You're not asking for an emotional response. So what's the impact on you from that? Oh, that hurt my feelings when it happens. No, what you're trying to say is, look, what's the impact in terms of, revenue? What's the impact in terms of bottom line results? What's the impact, when you're asking about impact to the person you're speaking with? I mean, first of all, you have to be prepared. You have to be informed about their business and so on. But you're asking them to quantify specific things. And when they have to quantify, then they're having to think more deeply about it, right? And so then you really you're digging down, you're going to find out what the real problem is. But it takes patience as a seller, because it's not about the first question you ask, and even the second question, maybe the third question you ask them. But that's what it required to really dig down deep. And this is why I think sellers oftentimes miss the ball when they're working with customers and prospects, is they don't reach that level of understanding. And that oftentimes means the buyer doesn't fully understand it themselves as well. And so there's a lot of value that's accrued to the buyer and accrued to you by the buyers in the buyer's perception when you help them really understand that.
Absolutely. And to get there, you need trust. Because
Yes,
if you don't have
absolutely.
that level of trust, you can't inquire at that level because then it's seen as
Absolutely.
intrusive.
And
So how do you
that's why the first pillar I talk about is connection, right? Is you need to be able to form a human connection with the buyer. And it doesn't mean you're making them your friend, but you have to be able to connect in order to build trust, right? I mean, without that connection, there's no trust. And was your 2 point precisely, without trust, you can't ask the questions you need to ask. You can ask the questions, you can't get the answers you need to those questions
right?
to be able to help. And so what I write about in Sell Without Selling Out is what you're doing is you're earning the right to ask those questions, get answers to them. Basically earning the right to stick your nose into their business. And it's something that should be, as you get a little more experience, it should be very noticeable to you as a seller is, are the buyers, openly answering these questions
Mm.
that you're asking, or does it ever seem like they're holding something in reserve? And that's, again, you have to develop sort of your sixth sense as a seller, your intuition as a seller. But that's a critical point is lack of trust. You're not going to get the information you need. You're never going to reach that level of understanding you need to be able to get to help the buyer.
Absolutely. First impressions, literally, it's under a second is when we make those judgments
Yep.
of Andy's a good guy. And I'm a really
Yeah.
bad judge of character, so you're probably a homicidal maniac, but that's okay.
No, I don't think I am, but you're absolutely right. I mean, first impressions are so important, and you have to prepare to make a good first impression.
So let's talk about that. So
Sure.
let's say it's the CIO of a company that is the target audience. You've got a tech salesperson trying to get an audience with that individual.
Mhm.
So what is a good strategy you would recommend that basically uh, makes that good first impression? Because the first three impressions might be totally ignored by the buyer. So give us a couple of strategies on how we can actually get that conversation started before we get the first appointment.
Well, gosh, I mean, preparation is so essential, and I almost hesitate to say it because everybody says preparation is key, but so few sellers actually do it.
Mm.
And now with the advent of generative AI, I mean, you have the ability to prepare at a depth perhaps that would have taken way too much time before that sellers wouldn't have done. But now in the matter of minutes, you can do this. So obviously, do the simple things, and that's LinkedIn. But more and more companies, you can find some of these already out on LinkedIn as companies offering sort of prepackaged prompts that are good for preparation for discovery calls. And it's actually somebody sent me one today that they had been working on. My word of caution is they're good starting points, but don't rely on these things because just like a good discovery call requires you as a seller to follow up, ask good follow-up questions, keep digging, ask better follow-up questions, take what you've heard, synthesize that into yet a better follow-up question. You have to do the same thing with generative AI. I mean, you may get these prepackaged prompts from these companies that are incredibly useful as a starting point, but they're also going to give you sort of generic type answers. So to get the things that you really want, you're going to have to dig, reformulate the prompt and be more precise. But there are systems out there that are using the AI to be able to track people's digital breadcrumbs and give you sort of a holistic picture of an individual you're talking to. One I saw a few weeks ago, a company called XIQ, they filter that all through a disc profile. Everything you learn about somebody online, process it, go through a disc profile. And so then if you were to write email to them, the system then would use language that's appropriate for the person with that profile, right? That's pretty cool. Tools like that are starting to become available, but you still have to apply your own thought to it.
Yes.
And that's really the important thing is what are the things that you think you can learn would be really important to this person? What are some questions you can ask that quite honestly challenge them a little bit, right? So based on your experience with other customers that you've worked with, what have you learned about how your product is being used? What have you learned about the outcomes people have been able to achieve using your product that maybe are non-obvious? And I think my experience is in every product I've ever sold, there's been instances of that. So take those lessons that you've learned internally as well and turn those into questions. But perhaps I call these insight questions, or you're asking the buyer something about their business that they maybe should be reasonably expected to know, but very probably don't. And when you ask a
Yeah.
question like
You give
that,
the insight. If you give them an insight,
yeah, and they think, wow, Umar's smart, right? I hadn't thought about that. Oh, I want to talk to him some more, right? So it's finding those questions, those nuggets, but it's being relevant, making sure that your message resonates with the person. And again, that's just really more a matter of preparation. And you may find through experience or dealing with CIOs that if it's new to you, you might have to do a little experimentation. They're not all going to be successful off the bat, but pay attention to what's working and what's not, and ask. Something didn't go well on a call. Before you get off the call, ask, what could I have done better?
Absolutely. And another thing that's kind of useful is like LinkedIn is so useful in terms of you're going after ABC company. You can say, I'm looking for a director of technology for the same company as a past position,
Mm-hmm.
and then reach a past employee in that general area that you're doing and saying, hey, Auntie, I'm not trying to sell to you, but I am trying to sell to your past employer. Do you have a few minutes we could chat? And a lot of times you'd be surprised how many people go, sure, especially if it's like, you're not going to sell it to me. It's fine. And then you can get some insights that are actually very, very useful when knocking on their door.
Well, try it, right? I mean, if the worst can happen, somebody says no.
Absolutely. So, Andy, before we wind this thing up, what's the best sales advice you've gotten? Like what comes to mind? I'm sure you got a million, but which one comes to mind?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a couple. I mean, just approach things with an open mind.
Mm,
I think the probably the biggest problem that sellers face is they think their job is to go out and persuade somebody to buy their product. And that's not the job at all, right? As I said before, your job is to listen to understand what's important to the buyer and then help them achieve that. So to
mm.
do that, back to a point you brought up earlier, is you have to be a problem solver. So you have to say, look, this customer, this prospect may fit my ICP. And I may be talking to the CIO, and I've been told by marketing that, ask them these questions and they're give me these answers. Yeah, you sort of have to resist that, because you have to understand that everybody's unique. Everybody's an individual, a human being. They've got their own perspectives on their job and their work. And if you go in with just sort of the broad brush and presume they're going to be just like everybody else, then that's going to be very problematic. And think about this as, sort of definition of business acumen for sellers is, the acumen is not understanding how prospect A is like company B is like company C. It's understanding how they're different. And when you understand the differences, then you're in a position now to really start understanding how you can be of best help to them.
Absolutely. And the magic question that I like asking is there a question that I should have asked you that I didn't?
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes they go, well, yeah, you need to know about this whole other thing that's going on that impacts this. It's like, and so sometimes, and you can only do that well if you've got enough trust built up. Then it's like, oh yeah, you should have asked me this. And so that ends up being a pretty powerful question.
Yeah. I mean, another one I'd give that's similar to that is I like to, I've gone through a conversation with the buyer. Again, there's no such thing as a single discovery call. At some point, every time you're going through a quote unquote discovery call, is summarize what you've learned to the buyer, and then ask them this, say, okay, so what are we missing?
Love that question.
What are we
you know
missing?
why that works? Why that works is there is a different filter that their mind's using is in what's missing, and they go, oh, that. Whereas if you didn't ask it in that precise way, they would just assume it's part of it and just kind of move on.
It's very neutral, right? So it's more like, what did we miss, right? Not what did you miss, or what didn't you tell me? It's just like, so what are we missing? And yeah, you're collaborating with the buyer, right? This is the feeling that they need to have, that you need to have, that you're in, they're not a target. You're not selling to them. This is a process you're going through collaboratively to uncover what's most important to them in terms of the outcomes they want to achieve, and then helping them get that. So that type of question is a very collaborative, neutral question. Yes.
So, Andy, I'm going to give you my evil world domination guy. It's like when I ask a question, depending on the question, I have the ability to change your brain chemistry. I mean, just think about that. That this is the power we have as sellers. By asking the right questions, we reveal what's going on and move the whole thing forward. So sometimes you take it as asking questions. Sure, I got that. It's like, no, this is a powerful responsibility
Absolutely.
to use it correctly, because you can move the sale forward a lot faster.
Yeah, I mean, that's what speaks to the importance of the questions you ask, is because if the questions are basically self-serving, as too often they are, you look at typical discovery call, and if you were to survey most sellers, well, what's the purpose of the discovery call? They would say, to understand whether the buyer is a fit for our product or service. And that's not the purpose of discovery call at all. The purpose of discovery call is to understand, as I said before, what are the challenges the buyer's facing? What are the opportunities they want to go after? What are their ambitions? Right? It has nothing to do with your product or service. You're trying to understand the buyer. That's the purpose of discovery call.
So it goes back to where we started this conversation. It's the definition of what we're trying to do and understanding it, as opposed to assuming it's our definition and not one that's needed for the situation.
Exactly.
Brilliant. So Andy, before we part company, is there a question I should have asked you that I didn't ask?
Nothing off the top of my head. No. I don't know. Anything you want to ask me?
No, actually, this was quite illuminating, because the biggest takeaway for me was that understanding the definitions of what we're really trying to achieve. And once a lot of salespeople are really smart people.
Sure.
And sometimes if you don't have the right intent or the right agenda, it can send you down a different path. And just kind of getting those basics done right. What am I here to do in this call is to give that customer an insight and get a better understanding of really what's going on, as opposed to how can I shoehorn their situation into my product?
Right. I mean, if you think your job is about persuasion, you need to keep in mind the research has shown quite conclusively that 100% of the human beings on the face of the planet have what we call persuasion reactance. They resist being persuaded. It's just who we are as humans. So why start on that foot? Our job is not to persuade somebody to do something. Our job is to help them understand what's a good solution for them, and influence through our actions and through the buyer's perception of our being able to help them, influence the choice they make at the end. And there's a big difference. And again, I write about the book, difference between influence and persuasion. Persuasion is being sort of a heavy-handed hammer approach. All the world's a nail and I'm a hammer, as opposed to how am I collaborating with the buyer to help them achieve what they want to achieve.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, we want to connect with human beings. And there was a really important exercise to do in one of the workshops, is where you put people into rapport, where, you're just sitting and using similar gestures, tonality, but you want people to have totally different views on a particular topic. And it's such an uncomfortable thing to do, to have physical rapport when you're actually out of rapport of what you're discussing. And the opposite is true too, is when you and I agree on whatever, and my job is to have a different body language than you.
Right.
Like, it physically hurts doing that. It's like,
I
want to go into rapport. And so build trust, build connection, and find solutions that everybody wins. Andy, thanks so much for being on the program.
Umar, thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating.
And if you're looking for more tools, go to my website at nolimitselling.com. I've got a free mind training course there that's going to teach you some insights from the world of neuro-linguistic programming, and that is the fastest way to get better results.